Our brains are intricately linked to the spaces around us. Our thoughts, emotions, and even sense of self can shift dramatically depending on where we are. Obviously, a forest next to a waterfall evokes a very different mental state than an office cubicle in a 14-story building. Differences in space allow for differences in headspace. But how deep does this relationship really go? How much does the structure of a space influence the structure of our minds? Are there states of consciousness that have become inaccessible simply because we no longer build the environments that once housed them? And perhaps more provocatively, has modernity ignored this relationship entirely, or worse, tried to suppress it? To explore these questions, we'll need to investigate not just science, but also ancient architecture, forgotten philosophies, metaphysics, and spiritual traditions. Neuroarchitecture is an emerging field at the crossroads of neuroscience and design. Over the past 2 decades, researchers have begun mapping how specific architectural forms affect our mental and physiological states. Using tools like fMRI scans and biometric eye tracking, they've uncovered how our brains unconsciously focus on or ignore elements of our environment. Evolutionary psychology suggests we're instinctively drawn to faces, to natural forms like spirals and curves, and to the edges of new spaces. Philosophers have long asked what makes a space feel truly alive. Religious scholars have searched for the qualities that make a place feel sacred. And today, scientists are bringing measurable insights to the conversation, making it clear that architecture is not a passive background feature. It participates in shaping who we are, individually and collectively. We can feel this most clearly in awe-inducing spaces, cathedrals, ancient temples, and sacred sites. Just standing in these places causes measurable changes in our physiology. Some studies suggest that grand cathedrals can increase gamma brainwave activity, which is linked to heightened states of awareness and cognition. Heart rate rises, skin conductance changes, our perception of time shifts. These effects are distinct and consistent, and they seem largely absent in the spaces we now spend most of our lives in. This video will explore the idea that architecture is far more than just structured matter. It influences, shapes, and molds us in myriad ways, and that forgetting this could be harming us. For most of human history, buildings weren't just optimized for maximum utility and efficiency. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they were designed to facilitate specific ways of being, to house different states of consciousness. Across the globe, most of the greatest works of architecture were built for spiritual reasons. Whether religion, ideology, spirituality, these works stood for something bigger than any self, or community, or culture. It didn't matter if the original architect would never live to see its completion. It had to be done. Ancient architects considered a structure's orientation with respect to the heavens, whether it was to be aligned with one of the cardinal points, a specific constellation, or if some aspect of it would align with a celestial event like one of the equinoxes or solstices. This knowledge of the heavens would likewise be reflected in the building through harmonious proportions, angles, and shapes, and this would come to be known as sacred geometry. Intricate ornamentation and symbolism would decorate walls and ceilings as well. Take the Egyptian temple for instance. Many of these would literally be a walkable mythology. In the Pyramid of Unas, as one traversed through the entrance corridor, to the antechamber, and finally to the innermost sarcophagus chamber, the pyramid text's message was intended to be read in that order. The walls of the sarcophagus chamber would be lined with spells for protection and resurrection. This seems to suggest a unique synergy between their architecture and language. Furthermore, the ancient Mayans constructed pyramids that doubled as calendars and acoustic chambers. At Chichen Itza, the echo produced by clapping near the temple's steps mimics the call of the Quetzal bird, a sacred animal in their mythology. These structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and the cycles of Venus. Among indigenous cultures, architecture often emerged from the land itself, heavily inspired by oral traditions. Circular teepees, longhouses, and sweat lodges were shaped by natural materials and infused with spiritual meaning. These were not merely shelters, they were ceremonial vessels that emphasized a connection to the natural world. Entering a Lakota sweat lodge, for instance, symbolized returning to the womb of the Earth Mother, a spatial initiation into death, rebirth, and purification. Across time and continents, sacred architecture functioned as a kind of psycho-spiritual technology, designed not just to shelter bodies, but to initiate minds. The Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, often spoke of ancient man's desire to orient himself in the center of the world. The cosmos was seen as a perfect order, and this order was sought to be replicated in smaller and smaller scales in the design of the country, city, and house. By structuring the man-made environment in this way, it resonated with the natural environment. Throughout nature, we see what are called nested holarchies, holes within holes. Each part is a whole in and of itself, as well as a part of a larger system. A leaf belongs to a branch, the branch to a tree, the tree to a forest, the forest to a biome, the biome to the earth. Likewise, the earth spirals within the solar system within the galaxy, and so on. Ancient architecture often reflected this fractal logic, each temple, dwelling, or sacred city designed as a microcosm of a greater cosmic pattern. By building structures that echoed the greater order of the universe and the interconnectedness of all things, people didn't just feel sheltered, they felt placed. A building had meaning because it resonated with something beyond the mundane. Later on, humanity's desire to make order out of complexity would evolve. In the soaring cathedrals of medieval Europe, we see space used to generate awe and vertical longing. The high arches, stained glass windows, and resonant acoustics were designed to pull the soul upward. Towering columns and colonnaded halls read like a sacred forest. The ribbed vaults and pinpointed arches of Westminster Abbey, for example, produce long reverberation times of up to 8 seconds. One becomes enveloped by an ethereal soundscape, where individual sounds are blurred into one harmonious blend that seems to suspend time. The geometric patterns found in these places strongly resemble what's known as cymatics, patterns created when sound frequencies are put through a medium like sand, suggesting an intuitive understanding of the relationship between sound and form. Qualities like these further acknowledge that the experience of architecture is a multi-sensory experience, engaging not just the eyes, but all the senses. In the Renaissance, the architect became a metaphysician. Thinkers like Brunelleschi and Palladio revived the ancient Greek belief that harmony in architecture could reflect harmony in the cosmos. Golden ratios, musical intervals, and sacred geometry returned. These great cathedrals, like many other sacred places, quite literally were the architecture of belief. These buildings emotionally engage us no matter what our background is. Being not just beautiful, but metaphysical, they embody a worldview that saw human beings as microcosms of a divine order. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, however, rejected many of these ideals. Things like ornate symbolism and awe-inducing architecture were seen as distractions from true piety. Consequently, this movement paved the way for modern utilitarianism, function over form, as Protestant spaces often favored plain and minimally decorated interiors. Sacred and harmonious architecture didn't completely die out, however. Many of these ancient building methods were kept alive by the Romanticism movement. This was an intellectual and artistic movement that emerged as a reaction to the mechanistic worldview of the Enlightenment and the soulless environments of the Industrial Revolution. Romanticism was a yearning for nature, emotion, mystery, and a return to the sublime. Central to this movement was the German poet and polymath Goethe, who famously said that music is liquid architecture. Architecture is frozen music. Goethe firmly believed that just like music, architecture should also stir the soul. Around the late 19th century, when the world's first skyscrapers began to rise in cities like Chicago and New York, the largest buildings mankind had ever produced are widely believed to be the great cathedrals. This is significant for a number of reasons, and I believe it also represents a much deeper shift in our collective consciousness. That is, up until as recently as 200 years ago, give or take, our greatest architectural efforts were devoted to orienting ourselves toward the divine. These buildings were made for gods, saints, and spirits, not for CEOs or data centers. They were attempts to work the immaterial into matter. Yet today, this is no longer the case. While we still aim to build higher, larger, grander, and more ambitious structures, there is no longer a deeper vision underlying it. We build for the gods of function, efficiency, and profit. The sacred geometry of the cosmos has been replaced by the cold logic of utility. Ancient builders may have intuitively understood the bond between form and feeling, but only recently has modern science begun to identify exactly which forms affect those feelings. The significance between the mind and its environment has been found to be so critical that architecture has been called the third skin of the human body, the first being our actual skin and the second being our clothes. The way we perceive and interpret our surroundings is of course an extremely complex process. Put simply, however, it begins with light entering our retinas, which creates a message that crosses through the optic chiasm to reach the visual cortex. In terms of perception, the hippocampus plays a key role. Studies in rats showed that the removal of this area caused them to lose their spatial map. More specific to how we perceive and interpret architectural spaces are the parahippocampal cortex, crucial for memory and spatial awareness, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which is especially responsive to curved forms. The cognitive processes that interpret visual information are sensitive to contours, colors, forms, and spatial situations. Naturally, we prefer curves, spirals, and fractal-like forms, as these have been most pervasive throughout our history. Nature doesn't really have perfectly parallel lines and angles. We also prefer things that have bilateral symmetry, which is seen in the human body, in the head, torso, and feet, as well as in the face, with its eyes, nose, and mouth. This is called a tripartite hierarchy, and it's frequently found in traditional architecture. When architectural designs have a clear top, middle, and bottom that is bilaterally symmetrical, it suggests an order that we can intuitively understand. It's also easier for our brains to process and relate to. When entering a new space for the first time, we instinctively stick to the edges. This is a trait observed in humans, animals, and even bacteria, and it's known as thigmotaxis, a tendency to avoid exploring the inner zone of a novel place. Next time you enter a restaurant, notice how most people will be seated along the perimeter. This behavior is subconscious and rooted in survival instincts. Many architects take it into consideration when designing spaces meant to feel comfortable or inviting. Our brains remain designed for the natural world of the Stone Age. There isn't anything too natural about the urban jungle. This idea is most potently summarized in a famous quote by the American biologist E.O. Wilson, who says, quote, "The real problem with humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." A 1993 study of 160 ICU patients found that our bias toward curves can even affect how quickly we heal. Hospital design expert Roger Ulrich monitored patient responses to 6 different views, 2 of nature, 2 of abstract art, and 2 of a blank wall. He concluded, quote, "A rather surprising finding was that an abstract picture dominated by rectilinear forms produced higher patient anxiety than control conditions with no picture at all." A similar study found that simply planting a few trees on a city block improves residents' health perception in ways comparable to adding $10,000 to their salary or being 7 years younger. Adequate natural light from windows is also crucial for mental health, as explored in another study. All of this research seems to suggest that specific design choices, like adding recognizable landmarks throughout a space, can even help those with cognitive disabilities. So what exactly are the effects of different kinds of architecture? Turns out there are a lot of factors involved. Not only individual subjectivity, but also lighting, acoustics, color, materials, and of course the actual spatial elements like size and ornamentation. High ceilings, whether vaulted or domed, activate the default mode network, the area linked to creativity, introspection, and altered states of consciousness. Being in a room with high ceilings also encourages abstract thought and the sense of awe. Vertical emphasis naturally draws the gaze upward, inspiring reverence. Conversely, enclosed or restrictive spaces with lower ceilings activate the task-focused brain, narrowing attention and cognitive flexibility. Being inside too small of a place can also create a sense of time compression, making experiences feel shorter or rushed, as well as potentially leading to a spike in cortisol. leading to feelings of confinement, tension, or anxiety. Different colors in architectural spaces have an impact on mental states as well. One study found that blue environments led to increased respiratory and skin conductance responses compared to white and black settings. Blue spaces can help promote a relaxed but alert state of mind, something like being peacefully focused, which is linked to emotional processing. The color red boosts blood flow to the muscles, activates the sympathetic nervous system, and raises brainwave activity, all of which quickens breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. The popularity of the back rooms, it seems, might serve as an interesting case study into how we feel about modern environments. In essence, the back rooms are essentially the archetypal office space, the most concentrated form of it as an idea. The endless, windowless rooms, hallways, and cubicles, draped in the dingy yellow tint of buzzing fluorescent lights, while obviously a parody of modern offices, has gained its popularity as a meme simply because of how terrifying it is. By simply designing a space in this way, it becomes a place where only fear and hopelessness are felt. And so it follows that some design choices can actually harm our well-being and even lead to increased risk of infections. After all, the connection between our minds and bodies runs deep. Furthermore, the widespread use of artificial light messes up our body's natural clock, something crucial for regulating sleep. Modern environments are filled with repetitive parallel lines, blank surfaces, and jagged forms. Eye-tracking studies have demonstrated that when people are shown images of modern buildings with large glass facades lacking any natural or face-like qualities, almost always people avert their eyes from the building itself, instead unconsciously locking their eyes onto any people or vehicles in the background. Studies also show that jagged, angular forms can stress the brain, requiring more oxygen uptake to the visual cortex to efficiently process. Likewise, the amygdala, involved in the fear response, shows significantly higher activation in the presence of jagged forms compared to curves. All of this is likely so for evolutionary reasons, as pointed shapes frequently stood for ever-present threats in our environment. It would have been advantageous to quickly sense these threats and be able to flee if needed. Looking at pictures of old towns and cities, we can get a sense that these places were designed as places of sensory engagement. Loitering and lingering was common, if not encouraged. This is in sharp contrast to many of today's modern public spaces, where a general sense of sensory deprivation can be felt. In stripping our spaces of complexity, beauty, and natural cues, we may have created a sensory void, one we now try to fill with screens, noise, and algorithmic distraction. As we dive deeper into the neuroscience underlying architecture, we can begin to realize that architecture serves a far deeper role than merely its functional utility or economic value. Buildings are extensions of ourselves, both individually and collectively. In many ways, they act as mediators between our consciousness and the world, helping to internalize the world and externalize the mind. Architecture is a manifestation of our mental space, and our mental space is influenced by the architecture around us. The French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty described this reciprocity between perception and environment as the chiasmatic bind. This phenomenological idea highlights this interconnectedness between the mental and physical world, where a sort of dialectical relationship causes each influence to influence the other. This raises an interesting question. What kind of spaces are we building, and what kind of people are they shaping us to become? Architectural theorist Juhani Pallasmaa writes, "An architectural work is not experienced as an isolated collection of visual pictures, but in its fully embodied material and spiritual presence. A work of architecture incorporates and infuses both physical and mental structures. The visual frontality of the architectural drawing is lost in the real experience of architecture. Good architecture offers shapes and surfaces molded for the pleasurable touch of the eye. Architecture serves as a way to frame, structure, and focus our thoughts. A home is a refuge, a place for daydreaming, acting as a shelter for drifting inward. Being inside a room helps to contain our thoughts and prevent them from getting lost. Being outdoors can bring dreamy and expansive thoughts, but we often need the geometry of a room to think clearly. Within different architectural works, there is always a suggestion of action, and this is what separates it from other forms of art. The door pull is the handshake of a building, which can be inviting and courteous, or forbidding and aggressive. A home is structured in a way that separates different activities. Stepping stones, stairways, and so on all suggest the possibility of human interaction. The objects which surround my body reflect its possible action upon them, writes philosopher Henri Bergson. The greatest architects know that imagination and reverie are not stirred by uniform brightness, but by the interplay of shadow and light. Homogeneous bright light paralyzes the imagination, in the same way that the homogenization of space removes any sense of place in a given setting. In great architectural spaces, there is a constant breathing of shadow and light. Shadow inhales and illumination exhales light. In sacred spaces, light breathes. Today, light is just a quantitative matter, and windows have lost their significance as mediators between two worlds. The window mediates between exteriority and interiority, public and private, light and dark. In our times, this ontological richness is often lost, and the window has turned into a mere absence of the wall. In emotional states, sense stimuli seem to shift from the more refined senses toward the more archaic, from vision down to hearing, touch, and smell, and from light to shadow. A culture that seeks to control its citizens is likely to promote the opposite direction of interaction, away from intimate individuality and identification towards a public and distant detachment. A society of surveillance is necessarily a society of the voyeuristic and sadistic eye. An efficient method of mental torture is the use of a constantly high level of illumination that leaves no space for mental withdrawal or privacy. Even the dark interiority of self is exposed and violated. On the phenomenon of light and architecture, some interesting insights can be found in John Gebser's Ever-Present Origin. He talks about how the most primordial expressions of architecture would have been the cave, with its enveloping darkness. As humanity's consciousness evolved, we would gradually come to bring more and more light into the interiors of our spaces. Through the use of larger exterior windows, which first can be seen following the Renaissance, the increasing illumination of our living spaces coincided with increasing mental illumination. And what about today? Many buildings are made almost entirely of glass, and this too directly corresponds to one of the key characteristics of the integral consciousness structure, transparency. Interiority and exteriority are presented simultaneously. In the same way that the most natural design for a plane mimics a bird and a ship imitates a fish, so too should buildings imitate the forms, rhythms, and intelligence of the natural world, so that we can feel more alive and become more fully ourselves. This is the basic idea behind biophilic design, that human beings thrive in environments that echo the living systems we evolved in. Some key elements of biophilic design include many of the qualities we've already explored: natural light, plants, water, and curved or fractal forms. But it also includes spaces that invite engagement, encourage lingering, and evoke a sense of belonging to a specific time and place. A place feels alive not only when it contains natural elements, but when it contains meaning, when it tells a story. Humans love stories. We're a narrative-driven species by design, and this can serve as a very potent way to make it feel truly alive. Hopefully by now we can begin to see the profound potential that architecture has on influencing the human experience. Different structures can act as both pathways or barriers to our thoughts, memories, and emotions. What are the limits of our psychological potential if we designed our environments not just for productivity and efficiency, but for clarity of mind, expansion of consciousness, and wholeness of being? What could we become if we remembered how to build for the mind and soul? Architect Christopher Alexander spent his life exploring this question. In The Timeless Way of Building, He described something he called the quality without a name, a kind of quiet presence found in the best buildings, streets, and homes. It's a quality that cannot be measured, but is immediately felt. These places were not merely constructed, they were grown, shaped by intuition, care, and deep responsiveness to human life. Alexander believed that truly living spaces emerge not from blueprints, but from patterns. These patterns give rise to what he called a living structure, a building that breathes, nourishes, and participates in the life around it. The specific patterns out of which a building or town is made may be alive or dead. To the extent they are alive, they let our inner forces loose and set us free. But when they are dead, they keep us locked in inner conflict. The timeless task of architecture is to create lived and embodied existential metaphors that concretize and structure our being in the world. In memorable experiences of architecture, space, matter, and time fuse into one singular dimension, into the basic substance of being that penetrates our consciousness. All of this calls for a deep understanding of the human condition. Our environments shape our minds, and our minds shape our bodies, our relationships, and our futures. Becoming conscious of this relationship is not a luxury, it's a necessity. That'll be all for this one. Let me know your thoughts below. Till next time, stay curious. Peace.